Appendix, a reflection on field research and the politics of representation. Things are not going to change, Tracy says firmly from the front seat of Stephanie's emerald green Honda Civic sedan. Tracy is only 22, but her sense of maturity makes her seem older. She has made similar pronouncements during the 3 years I have known her, but this time she is exhausted and unusually emphatic, and both emotions come through clearly in this proclamation. Stephanie, who until recently was Tracy's boss, but is now just her friend, counters, as she has done many times before, but Nikki can represent it to them in their language. Almost immediately, Tracy releases a short puff of air through her lips, rolls her eyes upward, and turns toward the window on her right. In the past, I have freely inserted myself into this familiar exchange. Today, I listen intently, but in silence. I do not want to wake Tracy's 2-year-old daughter, who has fallen asleep on my shoulder. I am also tired. As we pull up to the university, where Stephanie is going to drop me off before delivering Tracy and her daughter to their West Philadelphia home, Tracy reaches a decision. "I'm out," she says, relinquishing her part in a struggle that she no longer considers her own. "Will have me end up fighting, and they'd, the project directors, be like, 'Look, I told you we was right.'" Tracy makes this final declaration as she, Stephanie, and I are on our way back from a shared lunch at a chain restaurant several miles away from the inner-city neighborhoods where we had spent so many hours together, meeting with young people who had been shot, stabbed, or injured, either during a fight in school or on the block. We had visited young people in their homes and spent time together at activities sponsored by the Hospital-Based Violence Intervention and Reduction Project, VRP, that served as my entree into the lives of the adolescent girls and boys in this book. Memories of one of those sponsored activities, a picnic, float back. Quite clearly, I recall watching a teenaged boy who sat quietly, trying, failing, and trying once again to make a bandage meant to cover a fresh knife wound stick to his skin. The wound was his reward for backing up his brother during a neighborhood fight. After observing the young man's futile efforts, I sought out a fresh bandage from an attendant at the community stables facility that was hosting the event. Many of the young people attending the picnic had never been to such a place before. Their initially tentative and then more boisterous behavior reflected both their apprehension in new settings and their acuity for quickly adapting to new spaces. When I returned with the bandage, Sadiq, the young man with the knife wound, smiled appreciatively before carefully removing the old bandage and placing the new one over the hole in his leg. Tracy, meanwhile, stood in the distance, counseling a shy young woman who, like many other young women before her, had adopted Tracy as her big sister. At times, the level of these girls' need overwhelmed Tracy, physically and emotionally. In addition to her commitment to her position as a program counselor, she was raising her own family, completing her undergraduate degree, and planning her wedding with the father of her young daughter and son. Sometimes, Tracy's frustration bubbled to the surface quickly, as it did in the car that fall afternoon. In many ways, the final scene in the car encapsulates the theoretical and practical dilemmas I confronted while conducting field research with and on the Black community, an amorphous, diverse, and sometimes divided community, of which I consider myself a member. Stephanie's response to Tracy, "Nikki can represent it to them in their language," suggests that I had adequately proven my ability to code switch and my ultimate loyalty to their side. Yet, although each of us identified as a Black woman, Tracy, Stephanie, and I represented 3 different sets of life experiences. Our experiences overlapped and diverged at the intersections of class, skin color, and sexuality. Over the course of 3 years, however, we were able to find a common ground that was defined at least in part by our identification and experience as Black women. But what does racial solidarity mean in our post-civil rights, post-apartheid, post-colonial world? Race scholar Howard Winant writes that today the concept of race is more problematic than ever before. Racial identities in particular are less solid and ineffable than in earlier periods, and they feature a certain flexibility and fungibility that is, Winant argues, unique to our era. Like other Black researchers who came before me, I was repeatedly inspired by Du Bois' The Philadelphia Negro, Drake and Caden's Black Metropolis, Joyce Ladner's Tomorrow's Tomorrow, and Elijah Anderson's trilogy of ethnographic works, I found out that it takes more than skin color to guarantee solidarity. It also takes more than the right shade of skin color to earn the right to represent others. The urgency and significance of these points ebbed and flowed throughout my research and caused me alternating periods of anxiety and confidence familiar to many field researchers, regardless of race, gender, class, or sexuality. Some of the questions that concerned me most during this time and still concern me today are those concerning representation. Who am I to tell these stories about poor, Black girls? What rights do I have to represent their lives? Which stories do I tell and which do I leave out? What powers and problems characterize my attempt to represent these girls, and, in turn, myself, to others? In this appendix, I reflect critically on my experience as a light-skinned Black woman and doctoral candidate in her mid-20s who was studying girls' fights. I focus this reflection on what I think of as the authenticity tests that I encountered during the first few months of the project, when much of my time was spent familiarizing myself with a group of intervention counselors who would facilitate my initial access to the teenaged girls and boys who are featured in this book. I reflect on the various challenges that emerged during my interactions with these counselors. I consider, as well, my relationship to the academy and the racialized and gendered dilemmas that I encountered, from the process of getting into writing up this research. On getting in, authenticity, and representation. In almost any sort of ethnographic endeavor, the field researcher occupies a strange position. She belongs and doesn't belong at the same time, and necessarily so. She is the chameleon stranger, that peculiar individual who is in the group, but not fully part of it. She is here today but may be gone tomorrow. In occupying this position, the field researcher is open to certain confessions from her respondents, confidences that likely would not have been shared if the researcher had been a permanent member of the group. In my research, these confessional-like sessions sometimes ended in tears, as the strong, Black woman before me broke down. These episodes revealed what other girls and women I encountered and interviewed may not have stated explicitly on their own or in response to a survey question. Even the toughest Black women and girls endure a tremendous amount of stress. They are, as I heard repeatedly over the years, tired. It was not only my position as a stranger that allowed or encouraged my respondents to open up to me in this way. In a racialized society such as ours, the stranger's skin color, and gender, class, sexual identity, and so on, influences and adds meaning to every social interaction. A sense of commonality, even trust, must be present before a person is likely to expose her or his vulnerability to a relative stranger, that is, to reveal what otherwise lingers in the back regions of one's life. How can such a trust develop in a matter of moments? How can this trust emerge in a setting where even the idea of trust is so tenuous? At these moments, it seemed to me, skin color and gender symbolized trust, connection, and solidarity. The Black women and girls I interviewed seemed to recognize that I was positioned in between their world and whiteness, the de facto race of many of the social service institutions in their lives, and the combination of that distance and closeness, as signified by skin color and gender, helped to create a space where some teenaged girls felt they could share far more than they normally would with a person they did not know very well. It is here, in this shared intimacy of the field research experience, where I developed my perspective as an observant participant in, and of, the struggle that teenaged girls confronted in their everyday lives. The intervention team. Before gaining access to the backstage moments of inner-city girls' lives, I first had to negotiate and pass the many tests presented by members of the Violence Reduction Program's intervention counseling team. Understanding the unique organizational and raced position of the team members requires first understanding something about the makeup and mission of the VRP. The program was developed by a group of doctors in response to their and their colleagues' frustration with the revolving door phenomenon, the constant flow of victims of youth violence in and out of the hospital's emergency rooms. Overall, the program took a behavioral modification approach, which was then implemented by a team of intervention counselors. In the winter of 2001, when I made my initial contact, the intervention team had 3 members, Stephanie, Tracy, and Diana. Both Stephanie, who was the team supervisor, and Tracy are African American women who grew up in inner-city neighborhoods similar to where they were now working as VRP staff. Stephanie was in her late 20s and had worked in the city's community centers for several years. She lived in an integrated suburb north of the city. Her older sister and young nephew lived in South Philadelphia, a target area for the VRP, and she visited them there often. Tracy was in her early 20s and lived in West Philadelphia. She could walk to some of the VRP participants' homes to conduct interviews with these young people. Diana was 30 years old, a white woman from suburban Ohio who was, she admitted, unfamiliar with Philadelphia's inner-city neighborhoods and the life experiences of the youth she counseled. During the course of the project, other members joined the team as intervention counselors. Jimmy, a Puerto Rican man in his late 20s who had worked as a counselor in inner-city communities for the previous 8 years, joined in the summer of 2001. Vince, an Asian American man in his early 20s who was raised in Philadelphia, and Sarita, an African American woman in her early 20s who grew up in Philadelphia's Carver projects, also joined the team. Other than Diana, all members of the intervention counseling team were non-white and quite familiar with Philadelphia's inner-city neighborhoods. In 2001, the VRP was housed in a small office in the city's children's hospital. The hospital was only steps away from the university where I attended graduate classes in sociology and criminology. The second-floor office was small and the 3 desks made the space seem especially crowded. During the first few weeks of the project, I visited the office regularly. During one of these visits, I asked Stephanie to describe how young people entered the project and to explain the design of the intervention. During our conversation, Stephanie began to talk about what she perceived as a fundamental problem with the intervention, namely that the tools designed to measure the risk of subsequent violence did not speak to the population. When I asked her what she meant by that, she cited the importance of understanding both the local meanings used by young people and the range of social cues that might emerge during an interview. Subtle cues, such as a young person's choice of words or how she or he carried her or himself, Stephanie emphasized, could provide a wealth of information, if the counselor was properly attuned. By the same token, key understandings about violence in these young people's lives were likely to be missed if these types of social cues went unheeded. How do people learn about the significance of these informal codes, I wondered. Can you train someone to be aware? I asked Stephanie. In her opinion, this was not knowledge that could be gleaned simply from reading books. In fact, sometimes, book knowledge could interfere with an accurate assessment of what was going on in the lives of young people. Stephanie concluded from her experience working with kids in inner-city community centers that the best workers were often those with the least formal education. Personal experience with life in the inner city trumped formal education nearly every time. Authenticity tests. She's not Diana. During my first few months of field research, I discovered that the counselors often used perceived differences between street and book knowledge to distinguish outsiders from insiders on the intervention team. Team members also used other members' ability to demonstrate their experience to draw lines between insiders and outsiders. Since I was a relative stranger to the group, the intervention counselors, especially Tracy, spent a good deal of energy trying to categorize me. To them, I represented a special case, a PhD student at an Ivy League university who was also a black woman. In their efforts to place me, Tracy and others paid attention to how I spoke, the type of clothes I wore, and how I reacted to stories told about other counselors or members of the research team. Tracy's retelling of an encounter Diana, the only white counselor on the project, had had in the field, for example, helped her to evaluate my level of experience with the people in Philadelphia's inner-city neighborhoods. I heard the story during a field visit in West Philadelphia. Tracy asked me if I had had a chance to go on a visit with Diana. I told her that I hadn't, but that I planned to accompany her soon. Tracy predicted that Diana would like me, she'll be so happy, to have company she gets so nervous. When I asked Tracy what she meant, she responded with the following story. At the end of a recent visit Diana had made to the home of a program participant, the mother had walked Diana to the front door, said goodbye, and then added, "Be careful." Be careful or be safe are standard farewells used by people in the neighborhood. These types of farewells implicitly acknowledge the potential threats of the street, but they are not intended as warnings of immediate danger. Diana, however, took this goodbye as a warning. You know how people say, be careful when you leave their house? Well, she took them seriously. According to Tracy, when Diana came back to the office, she told the other counselors that this interaction had made her very nervous. Next time she went on a visit, Diana announced, Stephanie or Tracy had to come with her. I laughed as I listened to the story. In recounting this anecdote, Tracy made clear Diana's difference from the other members of the team. In addition, with a comment that I would know how people say, be careful, Tracy signaled that she assumed that I had access to the same type of knowledge that she did, and that I too would find Diana's concern comic. By laughing at the story, I verified this assumption. If I had not shared in Tracy's understanding of the situation, I would have seemed as ignorant of local life as Diana. If Tracy had concluded that I was more like Diana, and that I lacked the real-life experience the counselors valued over the book knowledge implied by my academic pedigree, then I would have likely been distanced from the group. In that case, my access to backstage conversations, neighborhood settings, and the young people whose stories would inform my project would have been quite limited. During these first few months, each interaction with Tracy was a potential test of my familiarity with inner-city life. One such test of my street knowledge quickly became a running joke that strengthened my relationship with the team, especially Stephanie and Tracy. This test took place in a car when Tracy, Stephanie, Jimmy, and I were on the way to a home visit. During the ride, Tracy began to joke about how she was not going to be able to pay her rent that month, and so she planned to throw a house party. She would charge admission at the door to raise money for the rent. She paused before getting into the details of her plan and turned toward the back seat to address me. Using the deliberate speech of someone translating a foreign language, she began to explain to me what she meant by house party. Before she finished her definition, I interrupted, exclaiming, I know what a goddamned house party is. Everyone erupted in laughter. In a momentary lull, Tracy apologized for her assumption of my ignorance. Stephanie announced, she's not Diana. With obvious glee, Jimmy said, oh, we are having too much fun. Someone suggested I become an intervention counselor, and we continued to laugh and joke about this until we arrived at the scheduled home visit. My knowing the meaning of the term house party revealed information about me that was particularly important to these counselors. Furthermore, that I would take offense, albeit jokingly, at the presumption that I did not know the term provided the intervention counselors in the car with a clue about who I really was in terms of class and experience, and was not. In their eyes, I was a black woman who possessed the book knowledge valued by the doctors who developed the project, but also the street knowledge valued by the intervention counselors. I knew enough to be on their side of the dividing line between insiders and outsiders. Furthermore, I was certainly not Diana, who represented the uninformed outsider whose limited understanding of life on the streets had been gained in a classroom setting. The significance of passing this test was not lost on me. During the first year and a half of the study, the intervention counseling team facilitated many of my field visits. They would call me to coordinate visits to young people, introduce me to various neighborhoods, and help me gain access to other research sites. If the counselors had not trusted me, or if they had found it difficult to interact with me, I would have been forced to end the study not long after I had begun it. In the weeks following the house party moment, the counselors became increasingly comfortable around me. They would often joke that I should write a book about them, and not about the young people in the project. An additional signal of my inclusion in the group was that I became subject to the same face-to-face teasing team members traded with one another. In these back-and-forth exchanges, frequently initiated by Tracy, class markers emerged as signs of within-group difference. For instance, Tracy would sometimes point to my Kenneth Cole shoes or leather backpack and announce to the group that I must be secretly rich. She also made frequent references to my ability to use and understand big words. Once, while preparing for a workshop on violence intervention strategies, Tracy remarked to Stephanie and Jimmy, "It'll be good if Nikki comes. She can use all of her big words." This teasing revealed both my inclusion in the group and my distance. While I was a welcome member of the group, I was not necessarily one of them. Repeatedly submitting to and passing these authenticity tests eventually had the desired cumulative effect. By the end of that first summer on the violence reduction project, I was accepted as part of the intervention team. I went on visits regularly, participated in project activities, including picnics, field trips, and holiday parties, and helped out in any other ways that seemed useful. I had little trouble coordinating visits with the counselors, and they were becoming more interested in helping me. At one point, when I was unable to make a visit, Tracy said the next day, "We missed you yesterday. That would have been a good visit for you." As the counselors grew increasingly comfortable with me, they also took a greater interest in what I was doing. During the early months of the project, when I was hanging out, observing, Tracy would often ask, "What are you doing?" At times I simply told her that I was documenting the intervention process. I usually added that I was also especially interested in what was going on with the young women and girls in the neighborhoods. Stephanie, Tracy, and I would often have conversations about what I was finding. We talked over lunch, during ride-alongs, as we rode the bus, or while we walked in the neighborhoods. These discussions helped to illuminate various aspects of the context of violence. The conversations also reinforced the counselor's general sense that other people involved with the project were unfamiliar with the context in which they were asking the intervention counselors to intervene. Both Stephanie and Tracy seemed to assume that my unique credentials, not simply my skin color but also my proven ability to pass their tests, would allow me to translate life on the streets to those who possessed more book knowledge and less street knowledge. On decency and diversity. On that afternoon in the car when Tracy concluded, "Things are not going to change," both she and I were a bit tired of this representational dance. While I had proven my solidarity with her and her worldview, she did not necessarily believe that I would be able to effectively challenge or change the seemingly intractable ignorance of others who had much more power than she did. Tracy firmly believed that time and resources were regularly wasted because other people were unable or unwilling to recognize the diversity that existed within the inner-city community. "They think that all kids are alike," was how she frequently summed up her frustration. Once, as she and I were driving through her West Philadelphia neighborhood, returning from a farewell lunch for one of the intervention counselors, she addressed this subject at greater length. I often made use of times like this to test my working hypotheses about how young people negotiate conflict and violence in the inner-city setting. I suspect that Tracy always knew what I was doing, but she would listen patiently and offer her assessments or critiques, largely without reservation. That afternoon, I offered the following observation for Tracy's consideration: "It seems like there is a tension between the directors of this research project and the intervention counselors." At first, Tracy makes no response. Her exasperation is unmistakable, but the enormity of her frustration leaves her momentarily tongue-tied. Finally, she bursts out loudly, "All of these kids are not the same." It is not until we near her home that Tracy finally reveals that the real reason the doctors cannot understand the existence of diversity in the population is, and she hates to say the word, prejudice. The same lack of an inch-depth understanding also informs how they think about the violence that occurs in the neighborhoods. I asked Tracy if she thinks the doctors' misperceptions represent a fundamental lack of understanding about fights, in particular. About their seriousness and their consequences. "Oh yes. You get into a fight and they think your life is over. And don't get into one fight and have come from a single-parent family, then you're going to be a serial killer." Tracy and I continue to talk about prejudice and stereotyping as we approach her house. "Like that street there," I say, pointing to a typical block off Baltimore Avenue as a way to test Tracy's assertions. "They will think that everyone on that block is the same, when actually there is a diversity of people there." Tracy nods in silent affirmation. "If you know," I add, "you know." And the same is true in the suburbs, she notes before challenging the necessity of insider knowledge as a basis for knowing one's fellow human beings. "Even if you don't know, you should know." It is this inability of others to understand and to view Black people as something other than a monolithic mass of similarly situated human beings that frustrated Tracy from the beginning of the project to this day in the car. This frustration, of course, is quite familiar to Black scholars. Patricia Hill Collins describes what may be the roots of Tracy's frustration in Black sexual politics. Racial segregation, however, has created large numbers of white Americans who lack sustained, personal experience with African Americans. This group routinely must be convinced of Black humanity, a task that requires that they jettison racial stereotypes and learn to see and value Blacks as individuals. Although Tracy's knowledge of the diversity in the target population is informed by her understanding of her own community, observers less directly involved have reached similar conclusions. Nearly every rigorous ethnographic observation of the ghetto, slum, or inner-city community has recognized the existence of social systems based on hierarchical classification schemes. Three of the most notable discussions of the local hierarchies of Black communities are found in Du Bois' The Philadelphia Negro, Drake and Caden's Black Metropolis, and Anderson's Code of the Street. Du Bois, writing more than 100 years ago, observed, "There is always a strong tendency on the part of the community to consider the Negroes as composing one practically homogeneous mass. This view has of course a certain justification. The people of Negro descent in this land have had a common history, suffer today common disabilities, and contribute to one general set of social problems. And yet if the foregoing statistics have emphasized any one fact, it is that wide variations in antecedents, wealth, intelligence, and general efficiency have already been differentiated within this group. And there is no surer way of misunderstanding the Negro or being misunderstood by him than by ignoring manifest differences of condition and power in the 40,000 Black people of Philadelphia." As Du Bois suggests, class divisions within the Black community are not mere abstractions created by observers. Local residents also acknowledge these distinctions. In his study of contemporary Philadelphia's inner-city neighborhoods, Anderson found similarly important distinctions between Black people in Philadelphia nearly a century after Du Bois' discovery. Those of us with academic training or a healthy sociological imagination would likely trace Tracy's frustration to larger patterns of social segregation and racism. Tracy's appreciation of the diversity in the inner-city community, however, is not informed by this kind of book knowledge. Her worldview is rooted in her lived experience. Certainly, she knows where she is located in the social typology of the inner city, and her deep belief in the humanity of all people. After 3 years of work with the VRP, she is no longer sure that anyone is adequately positioned to make others understand the diversity of the community she serves. In the following section, I turn from Tracy's frustration with the challenges of representation to my own challenges in enlightening others. Retelling stories, from ignorance to enlightenment. People remember stories, is advice that field researcher Howard Becker once passed along during a visit to a graduate seminar I attended. This insight deeply informs how I represent my work in public presentations and in writing. What is the story? I now ask my students who are conducting field research projects. The stories are important, I tell them. Yet, in the academy, just like in the rest of social life, we tell our ethnographic tales in a social context that is informed by race, gender, class, and power. In recent years, who gets to tell these stories and how they are told has started to receive critical attention. As a graduate student, and now as an assistant professor, I have wrestled with the racialized gender politics that determines who gets to tell stories about poor, Black people and how their stories are told. I began to think critically about the structure of the ethnographic tale after I began receiving comments from others about how I told my story about inner-city girls and violence. Several people commented that I represented the girl's story in such a matter-of-fact way. As I reflected on these comments and continued to read the most popular ethnographies in the field, I began to see that some people seemed to be most struck by what was missing from my story. In an attempt to explain the inner workings of one group of people to another, many contemporary ethnographic texts begin from a point of ignorance instead of from a point of understanding or commonality. This ignorance may be real or, more likely, I hope, feigned in an attempt to connect with a certain audience. For example, Otherwise, progressive scholars may ask questions about poor women's mothering choices in an attempt to hook the more conservative policy makers and voters among us. While this may be an effective storytelling strategy, the continuing attacks on poor mothers and women of color make this presumed effectiveness questionable. However, assuming a veil of ignorance seems to result in an end almost diametrically opposed to what most liberal or progressive researchers intend their work to achieve. Many scholars aim to move their readers from a state of ignorance to one of enlightenment with the hope that once enlightenment is reached, policymakers or voters or other benevolent stakeholders will do the right thing. However, adopting an ideological framework, especially one that is inherently racist and misogynistic, in an attempt to enlighten those with the power to effect change can, and, I would argue, often does, have the effect of making the others understudy more unintelligible than they ever really were. Such a storytelling strategy may produce sympathy for a particular group, it is much less likely to evoke empathy, a deep and shared understanding of the lived experiences of others. Mitchell Dunnier describes the style of storytelling that I allude to here in his award-winning Slim's Table. Sociology, like many disciplines today, is constituted of some scholars who tend to function as politically correct stereotype guardians. They say, "You are guilty of carrying around an unenlightened, negative image of blacks. But you can depend upon me, in my innocence and enlightenment, to set you straight." Dunnier traces his own racial enlightenment to classic field studies of black life. He cites Drake and Caden's Black Metropolis, Elliot Lebo's Tally's Corner, Ulf Honners's Soulside, and Elijah Anderson's A Place on the Corner and Streetwise, among others. In discussing the urban ethnographic tradition, he writes, "I immediately recall how much more enlightened I felt after some of my own gross stereotypes about blacks were transcended through an encounter with these works." Dunnier's honest disclosure and critique reveal the importance of interrogating the assumptions and perspectives that we bring to our research. I came to my research with a set of assumptions and presumptions that influenced how I went about my work and, ultimately, how I represented this work. Some of these initial assumptions were challenged. Yet, it is important to distinguish between everyday assumptions and feigned or willful ignorance. In light of Dunnier's analysis, I cannot honestly say that I began my research from either ignorance or innocence. In contrast to the perspective apparent in many popular ethnographic works on black populations, I began this research confident that the humanity of black people was not a subject for debate. Like Tracy, I know of the diversity within the black community and I have some appreciation of the lived implications of these differences. Patricia Hill Collins makes a similar point in Black Sexual Politics, where she writes, "For me, evidence for the humanity of black people lies in the beauty of black individualism. In all of my work, this has been my starting point, not my destination." I am sure that well-intentioned scholars think that they are indeed breaking down stereotypes and humanizing their subjects by telling ethnographic tales in this way, that is, by translating the lives of others in a way that makes them understandable to some other, and this is the real paradox, better educated and more privileged yet still ignorant group of people. However, I wonder if in taking this approach, scholars participate in the kind of dehumanization they are trying to challenge. One could argue, for example, that taking up the task of proving one group's humanity to another group is just as dehumanizing as questioning that claim to humanity at all. Ultimately, what such an approach tells us is the all-too-familiar story about the position and politics of a particular researcher and her public audience. It does not deliver the story. Tell it. In the end, it is the story and the stories that matter. Most field researchers get to the story in a similar way. They become interested in a particular group of people, they spend time with the group, listening, hanging out, and taking copious field notes. They systematically review and analyze the notes and gradually develop a theory about what is happening in a particular setting or with a particular group of people. After years of this work, the story finally emerges, or is pulled, from this mound of data. Yet, discovering the story is only half of the work. You must also tell it. A final challenge that I want to consider briefly here is the politics, disciplinary, ideological, and personal, of where stories get told. One of the biggest challenges in telling this story about poor, black girls' use of aggression and violence was the pre-existing context in which the story would be heard, one in which hypermasculinized images of black girls were already in circulation. There was little space within urban sociology to tell this tale because much of that literature is concerned with the experience of young, black men. Arguably, more writing on black women and girls is available in the criminological literature than in sociology. Yet, I did not encounter the girls in this study in a delinquent or criminal context. Where then, I wondered, would I be able to tell their stories? This challenge was highlighted in a set of reviewers' comments I received from a journal that is sensitive to feminist writings and research on gender. The reviewers recommended that I revise and resubmit this piece and instructed me to resituate my discussion squarely in the criminological literature on gender and crime, instead of in the urban sociology of Elijah Anderson or the black feminist thought of Patricia Hill Collins. As I read these instructions, I was somewhat discouraged to learn that in spite of the advances made by women and feminists in the discipline, the same challenges that Joyce Ladner encountered decades ago in writing her study of poor, black girls in St. Louis remained. In her introduction to the paperback edition of Tomorrow's Tomorrow, a 25-year retrospective, she explains, Writing Tomorrow's Tomorrow was my attempt to reconceptualize the deviance/pathology model of black family life and black women and see them as resourceful, normal women who were simply trying to cope with some of the harsher conditions of life. What other scholars had traditionally viewed as weaknesses and pathologies, I chose to view as strength and coping strategies in dealing with stress. 1995, 12. In the end, I resisted, and continue to resist, others' attempts to label the girls in this study as offenders, victims, delinquents, or criminals, primarily because the evidence does not support such claims. Girls' lives are not contained in these labels. Furthermore, the language that girls use to describe themselves holds far more descriptive and explanatory power than the labels that others would force upon them. These girls are good girls, pretty girls, sometimes violent girls, and fighters who are deeply involved in a struggle for survival. My efforts to find ways to tell this story my way sometimes leave me as frustrated and tired as Tracy was in the car that afternoon. The challenges of representation are as real in the academy as they are in the field. In both settings we must pass tests and make the choices, personal, political, and ideological, that will determine if and how the story gets told.